A colony of cliff swallows in Nebraska. They look familiar, but something strange is happening here. The wings of these birds are getting shorter. Half a world away, in Australia, snakes are evolving smaller heads. In North America's Chesapeake Bay, turtles are getting larger. In Europe, antlers of deer are getting smaller. All these changes are happening with outstanding speed. And on the Galapagos Islands, evolution has even gone backwards. What has happened to evolution? There's a very simple answer. Us. For billions of years, species evolved by a process called natural selection. But now we've added a new dimension, the process of unnatural selection. Life arose on planet Earth 3.5 billion years ago. And over that time, it evolved into a dazzling variety of shapes and forms. But the process driving that evolution wasn't understood. Until 1859, when Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species. He showed that life is continually changing and evolving through the process he called natural selection. When animals or plants reproduce by sex, all their offspring are slightly different. These caterpillars look identical, but they're not. There are tiny variations in their genetic makeup. Purely by chance, some are better adapted to their environment than others. Those less well adapted are more likely to die. The fitter ones survive. Selected by nature to breed and pass on their successful genes to the next generation. And so the slow driving force of evolution continues. This is natural selection. Then, a few 100,000 years ago, one species arose that changed all that. Our own ancestors evolved on the plains of East Africa and quickly spread across the globe. In the blink of an eye, on the timescale of evolution, we turned grasslands and forests into fields and cities. We polluted air and water. We transformed the planet beyond recognition, and in doing so, we also changed the course of evolution. Just as the natural world shaped evolution for billions of years, so now does our unnatural world. That world began 10,000 years ago. At that time, people living in the Middle East survived by hunting game and by collecting the seeds of wild grasses, including the ancestors of our familiar wheat. But the seeds of this ancient wheat weren't easy to gather. Try to harvest the ripe seed heads, and they shatter, scattering the seeds among the dirt, making them hard to collect. At the National Institute of Agricultural Botany in Cambridge, in the UK, Phil Howell still grows these ancient forms of wheat.
As these plants grow towards maturity, the seeds that are forming on them fall to the ground. It's a seed dispersal mechanism. So these early farmers were probably having to sweep grains off the floor with all the dirt and stones and so on before they could bring them back and pound them with a pestle and mortar and make flour and make bread. And then one day, one of the farmers spotted a plant like this, where the seeds didn't fall on the floor, they stayed there on the plant itself. And obviously that's much better. You can harvest the whole plant, bring all the seeds back, much, much more efficient. And instead of just taking all of these seeds and pounding them and getting the flour out, they kept a few seeds back and planted them for the next season's crop. Until eventually, everything they grew kept hold of its seeds at harvest time. They weren't having to pick them up off the floor. And that's kind of the birth of agriculture.
By selecting those varieties of grass that were most useful to them, the people of the Middle East created a completely new plant: domesticated wheat. And this laid the foundations for humanity's success. Thanks to agriculture, human populations exploded. But even before we became farmers, we had already started our first experiments in unnatural selection. Around 30,000 years ago, we brought wild animals to our firesides. A wolf pup. Its pack might have been killed to protect the tribe, or as competitors when hunting. But reared amongst humans from an early age, some wolves became tame. Their keen senses a perfect early warning for their human companions, or to help them track game. The most tame and the most useful were then bred together, and the wolf began its journey from wild animal to domestic dog. From this one species, we created breeds that look nothing like a wolf and look nothing like each other. How is this possible? How can the wolf's behavior and appearance change so radically? In the 1950s, an experiment with foxes showed how quickly the first stages can happen. The most tame and friendly cubs from each litter were selected and bred together. And this was repeated over several generations. In just a few generations, the foxes became tame. But they also began to look different, with flatter faces and floppy ears. These were all features of young cubs. Breeding for tameness arrests the fox's development. And their fur grew patches of white. They soon looked less like foxes and more like domestic dogs. The same thing happened to wolves as our ancestors selected them for tameness, creating domestic dogs that we recognize today. More recently, we've been selecting random traits for spots or short legs, for large sizes or shaggy coats, to create today's familiar dog breeds. What began as accidental selection around 30,000 years ago is now very deliberate. but wholly unnatural. Deliberate unnatural selection doesn't just change the course of evolution, it can be made to run evolution backwards. We can now create a long-lost wild creature. Cattle. Descended from the European wild ox called the aurochs around 10,000 years ago. Aurochs were huge, and big herds of them, grazing and browsing, helped to shape the nature of the wild woods that covered much of Europe. But by the mid-1600s, they were extinct. Now, a project in the Netherlands is beginning to bring back the aurochs. Not just as a prehistoric curiosity, but to use them on nature reserves to recreate their role as grazers and browsers that once shaped the ecology of Europe. Some scientists now think that Europe's original wild wood wasn't a vast, tangled forest, but a mosaic of forest and open grasslands, maintained by big grazing animals like aurochs. But before we can recreate the aurochs, we need its genetic code, the makeup of its DNA. At Wageningen University in the Netherlands, Richard Kroijmans is collecting the remains of aurochs from all over Europe, trying to piece together its genetic code.
If you want to rebuild the aurochs, first of all you need material from the aurochs, your bone material. We just cut out parts in there, and therefore we have to extract that DNA and we have to analyze that. Difficult, but feasible.
But once they have the code from fossils, how will the scientists recreate a living creature? Much of the aurochs' genetic code is still with us. Fragments of it scattered across various primitive breeds of domestic cows. And that's where Ronald Hodery and Unnatural Selection come in. Ronald is part of the Taurus project, which brought primitive breeds from across Europe together on this polder in the Netherlands.
These breeds all have in themselves different aspects of aurochs. None of them has it all, because otherwise the animal would have not been extinct.
The plan is to crossbreed these cattle to try and reunite as many aurochs genes as possible. They have old descriptions of aurochs to help them, and the genetic blueprint created at the Wageningen University, which tells them how close their animals are to the original. The project has already taken its first steps towards an aurochs-like beast.
First bull, maybe it was a lucky shot. You're never sure, but by mixing the right breeds fairly fast, you'll be like 70–80% up to what you expect.
All the calves in this herd are now crossbreeds, each a step closer to the ultimate goal. The project can't recreate the whole original aurochs genome, but the animals, called Tauros, will look and behave like the aurochs. And Tauros, together with ponies like these, that closely resemble the original wild horses of Europe, can begin to take Europe's ecology back in time. On a few key reserves across Europe, they will recreate the mosaic of grassland and forest that cloaked most of Europe at the end of the last ice age. Humans have changed animals and plants ever since the dawn of farming. Darwin knew about this process and called it artificial selection. He also understood that this worked in the same way as natural evolution. Darwin knew that understanding artificial selection was key to convincing the world that natural selection really could create new species. He worked with domesticated pigeons, making detailed notes on how selective breeding could generate new forms. He visited the best pigeon breeders of the day and held long discussions with them about how they created new breeds. Darwin was so fascinated by the world of pigeon breeding that he became something of a pigeon fancier himself. If artificial selection can produce creatures as different as these pigeon breeds in just a few hundred years, then surely a similar process could easily produce a rich diversity of natural species over hundreds of millions of years. Darwin was convinced that evolution needed such vast spans of time. He wrote, "Natural selection can never take a great and sudden leap, but must advance by short and sure, though slow, steps." But he underestimated the speed of evolution. Examples of unnatural selection suggest evolution can happen far quicker than Darwin could ever have believed. In the wild, predation is one of the greatest forces driving evolution for prey and predators. They're both locked in an evolutionary arms race. As prey gets better at escaping, predators respond by becoming better killers. But we humans are now super predators. We don't just hunt for food. Sometimes we hunt for pleasure. Technology turned us into the most deadly killers on the planet, and this exerts a new, massive force on evolution. Natural predators usually target the weak or sick, but human predators, trophy hunters, aim for the biggest and fittest. The best specimens to display. When hunted by humans, animals with smaller bodies and smaller, less desirable horns or antlers usually don't get shot. They survive and breed. And this has changed the course of evolution. In just a few generations, deer evolved smaller antlers. And their bodies became smaller too. So when hunted by humans, it's better for the deer to be smaller. But for another creature, the opposite is true. A diamondback terrapin. Diamondbacks live in estuaries and bays in North America, such as here at Chesapeake Bay. They share these waters with crabs that are a valuable commercial catch. The greedy crabs are easily drawn by the bait in the mesh cages.
14.9.
Diamondbacks are just as greedy. And they're curious. The smaller ones easily find their way into the trap, but they can't get out. They'll drown long before the trap is recovered by the fishermen. But biologist Randy Chambers of William and Mary University in the US has discovered that unnatural selection is at work here too.
The world record for the most number of turtles caught in a single commercial crab pot and drowned is 90. So you can wipe out a large portion of the population just in one single day of trapping.
Yep, at 5.0.
In response to this, the turtles are evolving. Or at least the females are.
Unfortunately, the male turtles never get larger than this particular size. They stay fairly small. The female turtles, on the other hand, tend to get large, and there's a wonderful sexual dimorphism associated with this particular species.
The small males find it all too easy to enter the trap. But not the large females.
A female turtle, if she gets large enough, is no longer able to fit in these commercial crab traps.
The female turtles that don't die because they don't fit into the traps breed and pass on their genes for large size to their offspring. When the team compared diamondbacks from areas with and without crab traps, they found that the females in trapped areas grew much bigger and grew more quickly, becoming too big to get trapped at a much earlier age than the others.
So females get large quickly, and that seems to be a selection force that is being generated by the commercial style crab traps.
All these changes happened in a very short time.
In roughly 75 years, or something on the order of 7 to 8 generations, the female turtles have changed their size by roughly 15%. They are 15% larger now than they were 75 years ago. And that degree of change in size over just a finite number of generations is incredibly rapid. And most Darwinian biologists would say, oh, you can't have that sort of thing happen over such a short time frame, over so few generations, and yet we're seeing it.
There are places where natural selection can happen just as fast. Demonstrated by animals which now bear Darwin's name. The Galapagos Islands off the coast of Ecuador, famous for their links to the study of evolution. The animals collected on his visit here gave Darwin new insights into the process behind evolution. There are many different birds scattered across the islands, among them Darwin's finches. Andrew Hendry from Montreal University has studied these ordinary-looking birds for many years.
Darwin's finches are an amazing example of what natural selection can do. Indeed, the one that inspired Darwin's research in the first place. They show how when you have a single group of birds from a single species that colonize a new environment, they are exposed to a whole bunch of different resources, in this case different food types, so from insects to fruit to plant matter to seeds. And because those things require different specializations, particularly in terms of the shape of the beak, you have the diversification, the splitting of that one initial species to become specialized into different species. This incredible difference in beak size, all from a single ancestor that colonized the Galapagos Islands only a few million years ago.
This process of natural selection is still happening today.
On some of the islands, you have one particular species that seems to be in the midst of splitting into two species, and that's the medium ground finch. At one location, you have large and small seeds. You have a large number of small beaked ones, and then you have a large number of very large beaked ones with almost nothing in the middle. So you have the beginnings of the emergence of new species. It seems to be splitting in the same way that we think the radiation occurred, the diversification occurred in the first place.
But the Darwin's finch story doesn't end there. These birds are now also affected by unnatural selection.
We also study another site where humans have a much larger influence. From the 1960s to the present, you used to have these nicely distinctive two forms that might have been splitting. But in the present now, that has disappeared. And it's because, seemingly, the humans were providing all sorts of food resources for Darwin's finches, things that they wouldn't normally get, like rice and potato chips and fruit and things like that. For those types of foods, it doesn't really matter what your beak size is. So what happened was this beginnings of a split into two species, they're fusing back together again. It's a speciation reversal or a collapse. So reversing the process of evolution. And I think it's kind of ironic because it's occurring at the very place that was so inspirational for Darwin in the first place.
On the Galapagos, something as simple as humans throwing away food is turning back the evolutionary clock, reversing the formation of new species. Yet in many places we deliberately encourage birds by providing lots of easy food. No one has studied the effects we're having. But it's possible these birds could already be evolving into something new. Studies on other birds are already showing that evolution can respond with incredible speed to human influences. Every year, 18 million birds in the US are killed by traffic. Cliff swallows have taken to nesting on freeway bridges, which puts them in serious danger of being hit by a car or truck. The perfect situation for unnatural selection to begin its work. Charles Brown of Tulsa University has been collecting dead cliff swallows for over 30 years. And looking back through his data, he saw something very strange.
Over time, we began to notice that we were seeing fewer and fewer of these dead birds on the road. And we found that the birds that had been killed by cars had significantly longer wings than the other birds in the population.
It seems that in this population, cliff swallows have evolved shorter wings in the 30 years since Charles began his studies.
The wing length in this population has declined by between 5 and 7 millimeters over the 30 years. Now that may not sound like a lot, but a 5 to 7 millimeter change is really quite a bit for a bird of this size and probably confers fairly substantial maneuverability advantages.
Shorter wings, even by a few millimeters, make a difference to the bird's aerodynamics. They're more agile, which means a quicker vertical takeoff and a better chance of avoiding oncoming vehicles.
Evolutionary biologists have always sort of considered the measurement of a bird's wing to be a good characteristic for that particular species. But it turns out it's very changeable, as our study shows. 29 and a half.
So, evolution has responded to our increasingly busy roads with swallows that are more agile in flight. But the biggest challenge to life is the jumble of concrete and brick we now call home. 2030, 2/3 of the human population will be living in cities. Already, some creatures have made this alien world their own. Peregrine falcons. Peregrines nest on moorland or coastal crags. So for them, these city blocks are nothing more than a concrete cliff. And there's plenty of food here. Pigeons. Lots of pigeons. The pigeon's wild ancestor, the rock dove, also lives on coastal cliffs. But these birds are more at home on the city streets. They have to stay alert. City peregrines are just as streetwise. The falcon climbs high above the city streets. And when it spots its prey, it dives on it from above, in a stoop that can reach over 300 kilometers per hour. A male has caught a pigeon, but it's not for himself. His mate has been brooding their eggs, and now she's hungry. And the female finds a quiet spot to enjoy her lunch. For peregrines, a city provides more opportunities than a natural sea cliff. Night falls, but it doesn't get dark. The city lights up the night sky with an orange glow. Many small birds migrate at night to avoid the keen eyes of daytime hunters like peregrines. But flying over a city, they're lit up from beneath. So the peregrines can still hunt at night, but they need to change their hunting technique. They fly underneath the migrating birds to see them lit by the city lights. Then attack from below. So far, this is just a change in behavior. But could city life bring evolutionary changes to urban peregrines? Perhaps in time, even a new species of falcon. It's not as far-fetched as it sounds. A city is not just a concrete jungle. It's broken up by small patches of real greenery, parks and greens to relieve the grey monotony. And scientists are finding that these green patches act like islands. In New York City, these oases hide creatures that normally live in rural landscapes. A white-footed mouse. Jason Munchie South from Fordham University in New York is live trapping these mice to study their genetics.
White-footed mice seem to be thriving in urban forest fragments. Their population densities are actually unusually high.
Unlike the familiar house mouse brought by European settlers, These mice can't live in the buildings of the city itself, only in these green sanctuaries. White-footed mice in each park are cut off from each other by a sea of concrete, as effectively as if they were on real islands like the Galapagos. And just like the finches on the Galapagos, each population of mice is starting to change genetically.
When we're collecting genetic information, we usually punch out a piece of the ear. And then in the lab, we extract DNA, and then we analyze how similar or different mice in different parks are to each other. And we were actually fairly surprised that it turned out that each major park basically had a distinct population of mice. And we didn't expect that amount of divergence over what's really only 120 years or so of urban history in much of New York City.
So, given enough time, each park in New York City could evolve its own species of mouse, just as dozens of different species of Darwin's finches evolved in the Galapagos. City life is a powerful driving force for unnatural selection. And that pressure began with the birth of large cities. In the middle of the 18th century, with the Industrial Revolution, cities grew from expanding factory towns. Smoke belched out over the countryside, blackening it with soot. And this brought about one of the first known cases of unnatural selection. The story can still be traced deep in the vaults of museums. The peppered moth exists in two distinct forms, a light one and a dark brown one. Before the Industrial Revolution, the dark form was very scarce. The much commoner light form has a pattern that makes it almost invisible on the bark of lichen-covered trees. In these conditions, the dark ones stand out and are quickly eaten by hungry birds. In early collections, the dark form of the moth was a valuable rarity. But pollution killed the lichens, and industrial soot blackened the trees. Now the situation was reversed. The light form was easily seen by predators and eaten. So it didn't take long for the dark form to become the more common. Today, with strict controls on industrial smoke, the situation is reversed again. And the dark form is once more a rarity. But other forms of pollution still affect the planet. We fill our world with all kinds of chemicals, and they are a driving force of evolution. Chemicals called PCBs are nasty byproducts of many industrial processes. In the past, they were dumped into lakes and rivers, where they wreaked havoc on the local fish. In just 30 years, 2 factories alone dumped 500 million kilograms of PCBs into the Hudson River in New York State. Isaac Wergin from New York University has been studying the effects of pollution in the Hudson over most of that period.
You know, 2 plants have polluted almost 200 miles of river and affected the ecosystem and have affected a lot of human lives. The big problem with PCBs and related compounds is how persistent they are.
But they discovered that one type of fish has responded to these lethal chemicals in a way that they didn't expect. The tomcod.
They're highly exposed. They live on the bottom. and that's where all these types of contaminants end up. The only way you could survive in this soup of contaminants is to develop some kind of resistance.
And that's exactly what these tomcod have done.
Usually we're talking about a lot of genes involved and maybe a lot of genetic variants, but in this case it's one gene and there's one form of the variation.
PCBs are lethal because they react with one kind of molecule in the cell membrane, which is fatal. So, all it took was a tiny change in that molecule.
That molecule is slightly altered in tomcod from the Hudson River such that they no longer respond to PCBs and dioxins because they don't bind them. If you compare tomcod from the Hudson to tomcod from other populations, they are 100 times less sensitive to PCB toxicity than tomcod from elsewhere.
The tomcod shows how unnatural selection can overcome even the most lethal of chemicals. So what happens if we want to poison animals deliberately? New York City. Nightfall brings a new breed of animal onto the streets. Rats. But these are no ordinary rats. These are super rats. Brown rats are very comfortable living in our cities. Too comfortable. They're smart and seem to thrive on a diet of fast food. For more than 60 years, we controlled rats by poisoning them with a chemical called warfarin. And up till now, it worked. But rats breed quickly, and evolution doesn't stand still. When a few rats were born that weren't affected by warfarin, it didn't take long for them to breed and create a new population of super rats. Rats that can feast on warfarin with no ill effects. It's now much harder to kill these rats, and many are concerned that plagues of super rats will overrun cities sooner than we expected. Today, rats are at home in every large city on this planet, carried there by our ever-increasing global transport systems. Ships and planes turned the natural, slow trickle of species spreading to new islands and continents into a raging torrent. Today, huge numbers of species thrive in places where they shouldn't be. They often cause problems for local wildlife, even changing the evolution of native creatures. One famous invader has already done just that. Meet the cane toad. In the 1930s, just 100 cane toads were brought to Australia to control pests feeding on sugarcane. The toads didn't like the sugarcane pests, but happily ate many native Australian creatures. they bred and spread out rapidly, a double disaster for the native wildlife. Cane toads release a powerful poison from the glands on their back, so anything that tries to eat one will probably die. And Australian wildlife doesn't know any better. Some would-be predators are evolving resistance to the cane toad's poison. But others are changing in a very different way, as Ben Phillips from James Cook University in Australia has discovered.
So this is a red-bellied black snake from North Queensland. These guys have a remarkable story to tell when it comes to cane toads. When toads first arrived in the area, many populations of these snakes went extinct.
But small toads are less toxic than big ones, so snakes that only eat small toads are more likely to survive.
A snake with a larger head can eat a larger toad. A snake with a small head can only eat a small toad. And so what we found is that the snakes that were left over tended to be the ones with smaller heads. And so one of the evolutionary consequences of the arrival of toads has been that snakes' heads have shrunk over time.
But it's not only the snakes that are changing. The toads themselves are also evolving as they spread all over the country. The ones at the front of the invasion find themselves in rich new territory, free from competition, and getting there first gives them an advantage.
What's happened as toads have spread across northern Australia is that their legs have got longer, their tibia has increased in length relative to their body size. So toads on the invasion front have noticeably longer legs. Where a toad might have displaced a few kilometres in the course of a wet season, they'll now move in excess of 55 kilometres. And so the rate at which toads invade new areas has increased from about 10 kilometres a year to closer to 60 kilometres a year now across northern Australia. So they really have evolved very rapidly over the course of 70 years to become even more formidable invaders than they already were.
Cane toads are having devastating effects on native species. Some, like the snake, are changing and will survive. But other species can't adapt. Many species across the globe are struggling to survive in the modern world. Like the common crane in Europe. Its wetland habitats were drained and it was hunted for food. Its numbers fell dramatically, and in places like Britain, it disappeared entirely. Now the Wild Fowl and Wetlands Trust are trying to re-establish a wild population on the Somerset Levels in southwestern England. Eggs from Germany are hatched at the Trust's headquarters at Slimbridge, but it's not that simple. As we've seen, whatever we do has some sort of effect on nature, creating changes, often unwanted changes. Rearing the cranes, it would be easy to make them tame, but as with the fox experiment, being tame might have other effects. So Nigel Jarrett and the crane team must go to extreme lengths.
To ensure that the cranes don't imprint on us as human beings, we actually disguise our body shape by wearing this unusual costume. And the reason why we wear the costume is because we know that young cranes imprint on the first moving thing they see, which in nature happens to be mum or dad crane. So it's very important that the birds don't see us as people, and that the babies grow up believing that they're cranes, so that when they're released, they can actually survive as wild birds. The business end of the costume is this artificial head and neck painted to look just like mum and dad crane. And then, unlike mum and dad crane, we've got a spoon on the end of the beak. And every time they do something positive, like follow us, we give them some food. So it's really important that we imprint them on this head so that the birds will grow up thinking they're cranes and not people.
And so far, the project has worked. Back in the wild, the cranes show no signs of tameness towards humans and form pair bonds with other cranes, just like birds born and raised in the wild.
This year we had a pair build a nest, lay at least one egg and hatch a chick in that nest, so we're delighted with the success of the project.
The Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust have avoided the problems of unnatural selection in recreating a wild population of birds. But the effects of unnatural selection are only going to get more common. We're starting to change the whole planet. Scientists now predict that the Earth will warm by several degrees over the next century, changing environments the world over, and evolution will respond. Climate change raises worries about more severe droughts or hurricanes, crop failures, or rising sea levels. But all this recent work on unnatural selection has shown that climate change would also bring unknown and unpredictable effects on the evolution of plants and animals everywhere on our planet. Darwin thought that evolution was a slow process, played out over vast geological timescales. Yet he also understood that breeders could change animals or plants in just a few generations. So perhaps he wouldn't be surprised after all to see how quickly life can evolve. We can even watch it happening in front of us by the process of unnatural selection.